Hi everyone, my name is Peter McKay. I'm the Curator of Contemporary Australian Art here at GOMA, and to the left of me here is Amanda Slack-Smith, who's Assistant Curator of our Australian Cinémathèque program. And together we've assembled this year's National New Media Art Award. And we're here to welcome you tonight to our panel discussion with all of the artists. The past 12 months has been a really exciting time. We've enjoyed it immensely. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been a privilege to affirm the gallery's commitment to innovation and new ideas and to deliver those to audiences in the exhibition which opens tomorrow. The commitment and the energy of all the finalists here tonight has produced a fantastic exhibition. I think the best New Media Art Award we have had to date. So
we're biased, obviously.
We're sure, but it's great. I urge you to come back later in the week and bring your friends, tell everyone it's a cracker. So tomorrow afternoon, it opens to the public after the announcement of the winner, as decided by this year's selection committee, who are Sahanya Raphael, the Acting Director of Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, Amy Barrett-Leonard, Director of the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts, and Daniel Crooks, a very well-known Australian new media artist. Amanda and I would like to thank them both for their efforts. It's a terribly difficult decision. We're glad it was up to you. So tonight, we have on stage all of the artists. Everyone will talk briefly about their work, and then we'll open it up to a discussion with the audience. So if you could hold your questions to the end, that would be great. So finally, I'll introduce them all, the finalists of the 2012 National New Media Art Award. On the far left here, we have Robin Fox. Next to him is Ross Manning, Ian Hague, Karen Casey, George Khut, Leah Heiss, Petra Hemmenbock, Rob Saunders, and Kirsty Boyle. If you could please make them welcome.
So I think we'll start actually on my left here with Robin Fox, who is first cab off the rank, just to talk about your work. Obviously, there's a very strong performative element to your work, and you work with light and sound. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your work in the show and how that fits with your practice?
Sure. Well, I come very much from a musical background, and so a lot of my life I've spent making computer music, and that's now feeding into an audio-visual practice that I've had over the last, well, that's actually quite a long time now that I've been working with audio and vision simultaneously. But basically, my background is in music, and there was a certain point where I was using an oscilloscope, which is an old cathode ray television tube, as a prop in a piece that I was working on, and I was making some pretty annoying noise at the time as well. I'm sort of really partial to quite annoying noises. I was a heavy metal drummer as a teenager, which accounts for the appearance. And I was just wondering what would happen if I knew that I could feed sound into this oscilloscope, and I wanted to see what the sound would look like. And so I connected the left input and the left output and right output of my sound card into an oscilloscope, and it just sort of made a bit of a silly mess, really, until there was one particular sound that connected the sound and the image together, not at any sort of synesthetic level of colour relationship, because the light was only green on this oscilloscope, but it connected sound with a sense of geometric form, and it happened really in a split second. And I was so sort of besotted by that moment that I spent the next 10 years working out a library of ways to create sounds and synthesize sounds that would have interesting visual correlates, and I did that a lot with these oscilloscopes or cathode ray tubes. I then wanted to make that work. I performed that work a lot, and I got frustrated with the two-dimensionality of it and decided that I wanted to make it a three-dimensional experience. So I took laser projectors and turned them into three-dimensional versions of this same idea. And the fundamental idea at the basis of a lot of my work is that the electricity that you can hear is also the same electricity that you can see. So there is a sense of this synesthetic experience where you're connecting two modalities at once, your hearing sense and your visual sense. And with the laser works that I've been performing now for the last 5 or 6 years, the idea is that the audience, I essentially shoot them with lasers and play really loud noise at them. It's kind of like a Guantanamo Bay experience. But the idea is that they're standing inside a cathode ray tube. The idea is you're standing sort of inside a really large version of a cathode ray tube, which brings me to the work that I've made for this exhibition, which is based loosely, not sort of based loosely, but this is the origins of the work that I'm doing at the moment. Last year, I was commissioned by the City of Melbourne to build a giant theremin. And so this is the sculptural result of that, which kind of looks like an episode of the Jetsons set in sort of ancient Egypt. It's the way I like to think about it. It's kind of a 7-metre tall sculpture, which is loosely based on the idea of a theremin in the sense that the theremin is a musical instrument that you can play without touching it. It doesn't work like an actual theremin. When you play an actual theremin, you become a capacitor in an electronic circuit. And so when the council first approached me about building a giant one, I had to tell them that building a giant real one would kind of microwave people walking past, and that probably wasn't going to be an OH&S possibility. So in this manifestation of it, I decided to mount a camera at the top of the 7-metre antenna there. And the idea is that multiple people, in this instance 8 people at once, could wander around in front of the instrument and play polyphonic music with it. And in the research that I started doing into theremin and his work, I sort of discovered that he was also instrumental in the development of the very early versions of television, and particularly working with the development of interlacing and de-interlacing scanned images in cathode ray tubes. And so when I had to think of a version of this idea, this interactive musical instrument idea that would fit into a room in this show, I decided that I'd like to reintroduce a visual component to the work and present it on cathode ray tubes. But I wanted to strip them, as they are in this image, of all of their plastic accoutrements and all of the sort of branding around them, and just present them as sort of naked cathode ray tubes. In the end, they were organised into towers, and so in the show that you can see upstairs, there are 3 towers, and each tower is an individually playable musical instrument. And yeah, it's a very there is a visual relationship. So when you move in front of the sculpture, you can play actually quite traditional tunes on a couple of them, which is a bit of a development for me. I decided that I'd make this a bit enjoyable. One thing I loved about the giant theremin was the fact that it was actually fun to play, and people did have very musical experiences. When you sort of ingrained in the world of experimental music, you're trained to hate traditional music, and you're trained to think that all notions of pitch and melody are somehow evil. I'm old enough now to realise that that's kind of childish, and that people really enjoy making music, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so in this piece, 2 of the towers particularly have a very melodic component, and it allows people to play music together in any kind of combination. And then there is a 3rd tower, which is kind of, I had to keep one that's sort of a manifestation of my own gnarled personality. So there's one of them which is actually kind of a noise unit. But that provides a beautiful sort of counterpoint, I think, to the other interactive points of interaction in the work. So again, I'm hoping this is going to be a lot of fun to play. I also really like the way it sort of plays with your relationship with the television, which is such a ubiquitous thing, and usually it's sort of pounding you with information, and in this instance you can approach it and you can elicit a response from it that you have some kind of agency in. So I suppose you can vote people off Big Brother, so maybe that's a redundant notion, but hopefully that's what'll happen. Are we close to time?
Yeah, totally.
Thanks,
okay.
Robin.
Thank you, Robin. That's great.
There you go.
Next is Ross Manning, who is a local Brisbane artist. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Now, Ross, your work, it kind of looks like a really playful brand of American minimalism, but I think there's a lot more going on there, and it's more of an aesthetic journey on your part. Could you tell us a bit about your Spectra series upstairs?
Yeah, sure. So Spectra 3, which is in the show upstairs, is one in a series of works that I'm doing that is loosely based on colour mixing and electronic image, and kind of deconstruction of electronic images and how they work. All colour electronic images are red, green, blue, RGB, and mixtures of those get you other secondary colours. And so I wanted to strip that back and get down to the raw basics of projected image and projected media for this work. So I've chosen red, green and blue and some secondary colours, which I might play my video now. And strip it back to a very kind of basic form and a basic, a kind of, I guess, unsophisticated way of movement and automation. But I like to treat technology and media as a whole, so I give as much weight to really early ideas of automation and, like balance and gravity and and then marry them into really modern and contemporary forms and sort of have high and lo-fi together. And because I think that media is moving so quickly, if you concentrate on a certain part, you sort of get trapped in time. With the developments, you're never going to get the latest thing. So I like to sort of mix it up over the last couple of 100 years, 500 years. So this work, so it's got beams that are all kind of suspended one to another at a point of balance, and then the actual movements generated by household fans. And the thrust of the fans oscillating creates the individual orbits of each of the beams, and to marry that in. So that's sort of the optic engine of the work. And then I've also played with a couple of versions of a couple of variations on apertures for the show upstairs. So I've got small, so the light is pumping out in all the different colours and mixing together in the room as a kind of white light. And then as it passes through these apertures, it gets split again. So I've got, and the thing, the optical thing with the apertures is that it reverses the image. So if it's got, green, whatever that colour is, blue, red, and yellow, as it passes through a hole, they flip upside down, which is kind of a nice way, because that's like your eye. Everything is actually the other way up, but our brain interprets it the other way around. And that's something. So that there's sort of aspects of photography and camera and projected media through these apertures, and then on the other side there's quite a large. The second viewpoint is quite a large kind of widescreen hole cut in the wall, and that's kind of referencing the kind of new 16:9 formats and widescreen formats. Also, when you go into the excuse me. When you go into the viewing, the second viewing point with the big aperture, your shadow actually, you become a part of the work too. As you block the light with your body, your shadow takes on sort of a multicoloured kind of interpretation. So you get these kind of phasing phasing shadows of different colours.
Great.
Breaking apart the image as well. Yeah.
Fabulous, thank you. Then we'll move on to you now, Ian. You've described something as cinema-made flesh. Yep. And your work is very much a meaty, breathing, twisting piece of flesh. Do you want to just talk to us about this work?
Sure.
And the background behind it?
Okay. I kind of refer to it as something. Because it essentially is something, which in many respects, like our bodies go through different stages of transformation. We live and we breathe and we die, and our bodies then actually kind of transform into a corpse, which another thing essentially, and from that into another thing if we're kind of we meet the crematorium. So we go through these stages. So the work was kind of about, I guess, the transformation of the human body. The something that's in the gallery upstairs isn't really a human body as such, but potentially it could be. I was really drawn to the often quoted quip from filmmaker David Cronenberg, where he talks about this notion of like beauty pageants for the interior of the body as much as the exterior. We're kind of fairly schizophrenic as a species. Like we can accept the exterior beauty, but the interior viscera of the same body is often kind of, disgusting, which is a really strange thing, considering it's the same body, And a lot of Cronenberg's films, particularly his body horror kind of period in the 70s there, kind of really kind of explored that. So it's taken kind of cues from that and cues from, I guess, the aesthetics of the destruction of the body, which we know from horror movies, more so than anything else. And this kind of, boundary of the body, kind of what I think they call like the envelope of the body, where it basically kind of can appear to be kind of appearing in different kinds of ways. We're seeing parts of the body in horror movies, for example, we're not meant to see. We're not used to seeing them. We're not prepared how we're meant to kind of think about that, So I'm kind of fascinated by all that kind of stuff as an aesthetic. It's also very much drawing on William S. Burroughs's hallucinogenic kind of drug states in his book Naked Lunch, and this notion of like the body also in a complete state of transformation. I should say too, I mean, the work isn't specifically interactive at all. It's kind of really a kinetic-based sculptural work. I made a deliberate decision not to have an interactive component to it, only because a lot of interactivity is kind of premised on this idea of giving an audience a choice. I didn't want to give anyone a choice. I wanted to kind of confront them with the reality of this thing. I think that was quite important. These images here, which I forgot to flip through, are actually the work installed in another space without it actually being on a table. Here at GOMA, it sits on a nice custom designed kind of almost like autopsy kind of dissection table, which gives the work a really nice tone of like, you are kind of looking at it as some kind of examination, which I really like. It brings the viewer much in closer proximity to the flesh itself, And so I like that kind of notion of the gallery being closely aligned with like a hospital or a morgue. And in actual fact, the two are kind of vaguely similar, in the sense that, like, it's kind of this kind of hushed silence and the bright lights. I mean, it's kind of hospital-like, with the whitewashed walls and stuff like that, with lots of, dead artists' work everywhere, So there is this kind of connection historically, which I kind of found kind of interesting. A number of newer works I'm doing as well kind of explore that a bit more kind of directly as well. So the work is genuinely kind of, pushing the boundaries, I guess, of what is potentially what is beautiful, and I'm very interested in John Waters' kind of definition of beauty, which is this kind of idea of like a kind of reverse beauty, or a kind of negative beauty, So there's a great kind of writer, Mark Derry, who talks about this notion of the pathological sublime and the idea that of a kind of emotion that's equal parts wonder and revulsion at the same time, So the work kind of explores many of these things, but I'll pass it on.
Well, now we move to you, Karen, and your work is about the interior as well, but it's more about the mind.
Yes.
And very much an experiential feeling for the audience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the work upstairs is very much about the audience experience, and it's been something that's been important to me in my work for many years now. But perhaps I should give a little bit of a background into the project itself and where it actually came from. I'll speak over the top of this, but this is the launch of this particular project, which I call the Global Mind Project. Global Mind actually came out of an earlier project that I initiated with the Brain Sciences Institute at Swinburne Uni about 8 years ago now, to sort of, well, it started out as a bit of a research to sort of explore the nature of creative thought, I suppose, and creative brainwave activity. So So I've had actually hours of my own brainwaves recorded, so which ended up sort of feeding these ideas initially. But along the way, I met up with my technical collaborator on this particular project, Harry Sokol, who came up with a software. We might have to turn the sound down. Came up with the software program for me to be able to generate audio-visual effects from brainwaves. As I mentioned, this was the launch of the project, which I called Global Mind, in 2010, and I approached 3 performance artists to be part of this project, which Stella, who you just saw, Domenico Di Clario and Jill Orr. So 3 very different approaches that they brought to the project. The visuals and sound were worked through with me very directly. Each of them had their own sort of approach and various levels of collaboration, I suppose. But quite a lot of the effects that you were seeing there were actually being triggered or controlled by brainwave activity, including the sound. That project now has sort of expanded and moved on from there to the point where we're able to use those neuro headsets to generate real-time. Actually, I'll click onto the next one. I'm aware that the piece upstairs is actually using my brainwave activity, my theta brainwave activity, which is associated with the dream state. And what I wanted to do with this particular work was to try and kind of induce that sort of state in the audience, or create an opportunity where they might access that state of mind. So it's something that is also associated with highly creative states and also visualization meditation techniques. So the intention with that particular work was to allow people to sit there and become immersed in that space and actually sort of zone out or go into the zone, as I call it. And how I actually did that and how I actually recorded the data for that was while I was actually generating it. So it is a genuine neurofeedback loop that has triggered that work. Now, I'll just quickly run through a video here. This was a previous work at ICEA last year. This was pre-recorded. It wasn't a situation where we could actually run this thing live. But it gives a little bit of an insight into the work that you'll see upstairs later.
That's great.
Have we got enough time? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll move on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. Thanks, Karen.
Is it going to go? Click on a few. That's a bit of a sneak preview from a bad iPhone shot.
See it in person. Maybe. Right. Now, George, you're working on some similar themes as Karen, but you've come in a very different trajectory, working out of a hospital context.
Yeah, recently hospital. I started off this project working with biofeedback about nearly 10 years ago, and really interested in just what biofeedback could mean in terms of how we represent and experience the body, but also ourselves as well, and that idea about selfhood. And so it's really very interested in how we perceive ourselves through technology and how we kind of form our identities through technology, whether that's the technology of a camera an X-ray, or a paintbrush, all these different ways of representing. And so the technologies that we have now of computers and electrical sensors allow us to access another part of that identity of who we are. So what we're seeing here is a screen grab of the iPad app upstairs, and I'm measuring changes in heart rate as the heart rate increases and decreases, and then using those changes to modulate these patterns, these geometries of getting bigger and smaller. And there's a little infographic, a little layer that I put in recently where people can access in a more kind of logical, rational way what that data is. And so really it's about the experience of the audience finding themselves somehow through this technology, kind of reaching back into themselves like it's a mirror, and then feeling what it is. And that feeling, it's about qualities of attention is what I'm interested in, and how technologies shape qualities of attention and qualities of being and action as well. So, I mean, the great metaphor I like to use is you could make a sculpture that responded only to being stabbed with a kitchen knife, and that would put you in a certain kind of state of mind and affords certain qualities of interaction, whereas I could make something that kind of comes alive when you kind of relax and soften and kind of even out your breath and things like that. So, yeah, and just really interested in giving people that opportunity to go inside themselves, really, and to have a different relationship with themselves than would they say a mirror in a gym where it's just like, oh, how do I look? Does my bum look big? Blah, blah, blah. It's just like this is another way of looking into a body without so much of that judgment, I guess, yeah.
And you've got some video portraits as well?
Yeah. So there was a little fragment you'll just see here. There's there's a interview with this as well, if I can get the volume up. But so a big part of this work has been studying audience experience, and so thinking about the work as a social thing and a way that people create narratives around how you can experience yourself, or how you an experience with self in relation to the world as well. So people talk about, oh, I was thinking about my lover, or I was thinking about a holiday I had, or a fight I had at work, or things like that, and they just test how it responds. So it's a way of understanding that responsiveness. Yeah.
Great.
Excellent, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I think we might move to you, Leah. Your work has a very strong focus towards humanizing technology. Can you tell us how you became interested in that, perhaps from the nanotechnology residency you did in Victoria?
So a number of years ago I was involved in a residency with a nanotechnology company, and I was really interested in the idea of humanising technologies and the emotional relationship that people have with particularly their therapeutic technologies. And during that residency, I was looking at, it was a residency titled Subtle Technologies, and I was looking at whether we could layer nanotechnologies, they're very thin, over things that people already have existing relationships with, to take away the stigma of technologies. And through that, I developed jewellery to administer insulin through the skin for diabetics, and jewellery and vessels to rid drinking water of arsenic in countries like Bangladesh and India. And I started to play with extraordinary materials when I was hanging out with my nanotechnology friends. And these materials led to another grant, which is an Australian Council grant, that was looking at the idea of working with materials at the extremes of the poetic spectrum. And that was the lightest material on Earth, which is aerogel, 99.6% air, that's used as a insulation of spacecraft. Carbon nanotubes, the strongest material on Earth, shape-change metals, magnetic liquids. So that's how I came to be working with these types of materials. And so my work in the show is a magnetic liquid piece, and there's just a snapshot of it there. And this particular work, I started playing with magnetic liquid back in 2009, and I was really magnetised by I really became obsessed with this particular material because it is a liquid magnet, which is quite an extraordinary idea. It also has therapeutic qualities, and most of the technologies I work with are used for human health and well-being in some way. So this is used to re-adhere the cornea in eye surgery, because you can inject it, it's a liquid, you can inject it into the cornea and then wave a magnet behind and suck the cornea back into place. So if you need your corneas readhered, you know. So the work, this is the third iteration of this kind of work. It's on a much bigger scale than anything I've ever done. There's 24 hand-blown glass vessels that are small. Most of my work is around the scale of jewellery or the body, small-scale things. I'm really interested in the relationship between the body and small things, and that intimate relationship we have. So I'll just put the video on and you'll be able to see it. If we could get this quite low in volume. So, you know, 25 vessels, and in each of these vessels is magnetic liquid that's responding to magnetic field. And so there are magnets and motors and things that are concealed within the work, but you don't know that. And so it's just this sort of mysterious, very organic thing that's happening. And what I'm interested in with this work is that it elicits some kind of empathy from the user or from the viewer, because you don't really know how this is happening and why these little sea creatures are coming to life when they're going back to sleep again. And so you start to imagine different scenarios. That they're responding to me, and so people try and play it a bit like Robin's theremin. And yeah, I'm really magnetic. Look what I'm doing. Or B, that they're creatures, because people haven't come across the material before. They're creatures that are reacting to something in the environment. You know, maybe it's the it's the radiation from people's mobile phones. But realistically, what's happening is that they're nanoscale iron filings in a solution, and as you, I've just become louder, as you bring a magnet or a magnetic field close to it, they all stand up and polarize, and that's a surface tension along the top that occurs, that spikiness. And so it's sort of, they come to life and they go back to sleep again. And so I hope you enjoy them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. That's great. As we pass the PowerPoint down, we talked to Petra and Rob, who you filled one of our gallery walls with robots only to bash holes in it, but their delinquency demonstrates actually a degree of intelligence. So could you tell us about your project?
Yes. Do we have... Oh yeah, that's the first image. Hi, can't see anyone. So I thought maybe I briefly describe, since you haven't seen the work, just briefly describe what's happening. So yeah, we are embedding autonomous robots into the architectural skin. That's how we regard the wall of the gallery itself, and they are equipped essentially with a camera eye and accompanied by a hammer or a punch. That's kind of like their tool. It's literally a tool for of the eye, and as they so they're autonomous and start out exploring the environment. They're intrinsically curious. Bob will talk a bit more about that, and they don't have any goal other than exploring the environment and discovering things they don't already know yet. And this is where the tool comes into play, because as they get to know the wall a bit better, they can then start proactively interact and intervene with the environment and change the environment. And then eventually, as the wall opens up and more or less falls apart, they start also studying the inhabitants of their environment, because as far as they are concerned, the audience are performers for them. So there's this kind of like mutual or reciprocal relationship between the audience. They are performing from the audience's point of view, they're performing for the audience. Sorry, I'll show you a bit more. They perform for the audience, but at the same time, from the point of view of the machines, the audience performs for them. And just very quickly before I let Rob talk, the coupling between the machines and the wall is really essential for us. So they are not machines that are running around in the gallery space and interacting with people, but they're actually coupled with the environment we live in, because the work is essentially, we were interested in not so much creating a machine spectacle, but rather a complicit relationship between the machines, the environment, and our lives. That's kind of the allegory, that the work literally enacts and performs as it goes along, as it evolves. And do you want to talk a bit about? So it's really significant that these works are not, the robots are not don't fit exactly into this often common polarization of machines. You know, they're either extensions or servants of the human, or they're a threat, a dominant threat to the human. But we're interested in developing a more ambiguous perspective where they become accomplices, where they become self-determined entities that then are part of these complex relationships and play a role in this self-determined role in these complex relationships.
Okay.
So, can you do something?
Yeah, I'll do something with that. So my background's in artificial intelligence, and I've been fascinated by creativity my whole life. These robots are an attempt to try and imbue a machine with a drive, motivation to be creative with their environment. It's not a destructive act, it's one of trying to explore the potential of a wall. And so the robots themselves are programmed to be curious. They have what we call diversive curiosity. That is, they get bored. And then when they get bored, they try and do something to stop themselves being bored. They have a hammer or a chisel or a punch. That's really the only option they've got. But plasterboard's a wonderful thing to sculpt. And so the robots punch and they mark and they explore the potential of that before they break through, before they start looking at the audience, before there is the whole other world. In fact, we have to try and distract them from just spending their whole time looking at the plasterboard. The back of the plasterboard is boring, but the holes that it makes are really interesting
to them.
So they spend a lot of time just looking at the edges of the holes. Finding them fascinating. Right. Sometimes, when we give them the ability to see faces, they see faces in the wall. But then eventually they do make holes, they see people outside. We give them the ability to sense motion, they give them the ability to see faces. And they are observing us as much as we are watching them. And that's what the whole thing here is trying to unbalance the relationship that we have with these machines. They're not about being slaves to us, they're not about being captured within the wall. They are in many ways much more free than most of the machines that we deal with. So I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build just something that's untamed sometimes, and yet safely behind a wall.
Yeah, they don't quite break out yet.
You still want them to. You want them to.
The audiences sometimes expect that. Could escape eventually.
Thank you, and we'll just move on to Kirsty, who's been very patient down the end there. In another form of robotics, Kirsty, your background is in really puppeteering and electrical and mechanical engineering, and then you move on to working with Japanese mechanical dolls. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
Back in 2002, I found out about this mechanical doll making tradition called karakuri, and it's similar to the European automata tradition, but it's also very different. It was developing around the same time. I had an opportunity in 2002 to travel to Japan and meet.
Yeah,
to meet, he's the last karakuri master in Japan from an unbroken lineage, and he's 9th generation. This was actually the day I first met him in Nagoya. Basically, this tradition is closely aligned with Shinto, and each doll embodies a spirit and belongs to its own shrine.
And the other major difference comparing it to European automata is these dolls were intentionally designed often to make mistakes. They weren't always operating perfectly and correctly, and in doing so, they were considered to be more human-like. Something that's really inspiring for me with the tradition is the most famous masters back in the 1800s. They started as artists and craftsmen, but then they went on and they founded Sony and Toshiba and Toyota, and it's the representative craft tradition for the Nagoya region, which is also, and today there's a lot of, thank you, today.
Maybe I think
Hello? Oh,
Right.
Okay. Today, the Nagoya region, it's basically considered the Detroit of Asia. There's a lot of amazing innovation and technology that is produced, and a lot of research and development in that area. And karakuri is considered to be their secret in being creative with technology. So my relationship started with Master Tamaya Shobe back in 2002, and this led on to a residency I started in 2007 at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at the University of Zurich, and that's where I started working on a major commission. Was with the Museum Tangali in Basel and the Kunsthaus in Graz, which is in Austria. And it was for an exhibition of robots called Robot Dreams. And it was a really big honour for me to have this opportunity to produce this work. All the other works in the exhibition were quite Western orientated, the way they were presenting and thinking about robots in society. And so it was exciting for me to be able to show a different perspective of what robots can be, and also looking at the historical aspects and the cultural aspects. So my work, it's called Tree Ceremony, and her name is Suki, the doll. She's about 80 centimetres tall, and I hand-carved her out of wood. The process started in Nagoya with my master in Japan, and he selected wood for me to begin making the head from a tree which was over 300 years old. And the technology that I've used to bring her to life was all in Switzerland with the lab. And the interesting thing is, with the karakuri tradition in the 1800s, when Japan opened up to the West, the leading cutting-edge technology of the day were clock mechanisms, predominantly from Switzerland. And so when they arrived in Japan, they actually used a completely different system of time. It wasn't the same kind of system that we use here in the West now. So what the Japanese did was repurpose these clock mechanisms to bring these mechanical dolls to life. So me working in Switzerland and using modern day technology, it was almost seen as bringing this tradition full circle today. And in a way, me producing this work, it is a tribute to my master in Japan, and also my main robotics sensei, who's a famous roboticist. And he, in talking to him in developing the concept, he told me if he was working today, he would make a robot to protect the forest. So this is also these ideas, not just Shinto, but looking at how technology and nature can be quite connected. So it's a roughly a 5-minute performance that she does for a tree, and there's a transformation with her during the performance. She, in a way, kind of transforms into a modern kind of robot. I wanted to make it quite obvious, this connection with the traditional practice of karakuri with modern day robots.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, as you can see, it is a very diverse show, and artists are working different ways with technology. I think we might open up the room to questions. If I could just ask that you put your hand up for a question, we'll bring a mic to you. Just we are recording this to then go on our website, so it'll be great to hear your question. First question? Fantastic.
Thanks. I had a question for Karen, actually. When you were developing the Global Mind project, what was the biggest challenge you faced in, I guess, taking the brainwaves and then getting them into the computer or into the software, and how did you manage that capture process? Was there any other technology that you used, or?
The capture process was actually using another proprietary sort of hardware by a company called Emotive, who make probably the niftiest little neuro headset that's sort of out there at the moment. We have an arrangement with Emotive, and so we were actually using that to do the capture, and then it's wireless, so it was going straight through to that data was then driving our Visigue system. You know, each of the artists were individually.
What was the biggest challenge you had with that, do you think?
Whether any of it would work. We couldn't trial any of it. I mean, it was it was an enormous challenge actually doing that. And anybody who's ever done any performance at Fed Square, there's no rehearsal. So I got up there for the grand launch with all the hoo-ha of it, sort of, and we had no idea whether it was actually going to come off. You know, technically we thought yes, and pretty well it went off without too many hiccups. I know Stella triggered off an alarm in a vehicle a few times, you know, but
worked
and
really
we lost
well.
Dom for a little while, you know, sort of he's dropped out here and there, but all in all, you know, I mean, I don't think anyone noticed, you know, but yeah, I was seeing it for the first time myself, you know, so before that it was only in the studio. So.
Thank you. My question's addressed to sort of anybody who wants to answer it, but I'm just so knocked out by the kind of work that you're all doing. And I'm just wondering how difficult it was to persuade technologies, universities, laboratories, other folk to get on board with your projects. And can anyone talk about how they persuaded somebody to join them? Because it obviously must be quite a sell, quite an ask. And I'd love to know a couple of those stories.
I'll probably start the ball rolling then. We all probably have very different experiences, but what amazed me was how enthusiastic all these people were, right from the Brain Sciences Institute when I first initiated this project way back. And the Emotive group, who have been fabulous, you know, I went in there, you know, prior to them releasing their product and sort of being ushered into the foyer and put a little disc in there, and me almost being apologetic, saying, well, we've done this on little arts grants, you know, and they were extraordinary, you know, and then the level of support that we've got since then. So I think there's an awful lot of people in those areas out there that are very keen to actually work with artists. They see the potential. Someone else.
I think it's a matter of serendipity, really, and luck, because I was very interested to work with biomedical engineers, but also psychophysiologists, psychophysiology researchers, all people like that. But I found it quite difficult to get in there. And then I finally met Dr. Angie Morrow, who I've been developing this iPad app with at the Children's Hospital Westmead for kids undergoing painful procedures. And that was at a art science speed dating event held by the Powerhouse Museum. And all her associates at work were like, all right, you're just going to smoke a bunch of joints and, you know, have a big love-in. You know, it's just like all those bohemian artists. And in that hospital environment, people can also be, the other side of it is that you're very conservative and that you're dealing with very intense situations and you put on a lot of armour. So it's just finding the kind of the eccentric people within that who are like, oh, let's play. Yeah. Because a lot of the times it's just like, no, I'm really busy. And even in hospitals, a lot of the time, you know, there are research hospitals, but it's just so much work. If you're also working as a doctor, to then take that, carve out some time in your life to then do research. So I've just been discovering just the amount of time and energy it takes. It's like walking in slow motion in hospital research. So maybe Leah.
Just following on from that, it works. Yeah, I think it's about finding the right people and having it's really about a personality click, and it's about an openness to the potential of art practice and what it might be able to bring. And I found I've just been having meetings about doing emergency jewellery projects with hospitals and with the Nossel Institute about doing something in Mozambique and all these things, and the conversations start out quite cold, and then you show images of what's possible, and images, you know, an image speaks a lot, you know, and you explain what's possible if we have this dialogue and if we develop this relationship. But it really is about relationships and building them. They take a long time, and then you make friends with the friends of the person and then friends with their friend, and then you sort of end up with a really interesting network of people to collaborate with. Yep. Did you guys have...
They have love.
Love. Well, I mean, generally, I would definitely agree. It's always, I usually talk about collaborations like relationships. I mean, it's a chemical thing. It's either the other person is open, you know, for it, or up for it. What we run into is this, I mean, I think I could imagine this is generally in new media art, and an issue is often this sort of, but why would you do that? You know, it's this because we are essentially interested, you said Tingley before, the Tingley Museum, but Jean Tingley is one of our heroes. We're essentially interested in at least definitely functional, but not with a specific purpose or a human purpose or a human agenda, you know, but we're much more interested in, okay, what happens between the relationship if the machine develops its own narrative or its own voice. And so putting all this time and energy and money into something, you know, that does not clean your house and or whatever. Yeah, it's this, and I think that's really important actually in new media generally. You know, that we are opening up a field of working with technology that is not, you know, that is big an anti-corporate kind of like approach to its experience of technology, but also of course then that actually rips open, I think, the relationship we have with it. I mean
it's developing a more sophisticated understanding
absolutely,
about what a function is, and like maybe
exactly.
the function of this thing is to help us think about
absolutely, yes,
with technology.
Yeah.
It's a machine to think
exactly,
through some ideas.
Exactly, and perhaps thinking differently, you know, than the obvious or the common narratives.
I think that's an interesting point of like things that have a use value attached to them, particularly with technology, because there's almost like this unconscious utilitarian function that we expect, you know, and when you kind of do the opposite, you know, that's when things can get interesting, I think, you know. I mean, in my case, I've made like this massive flash with this series of electrical motors inside, which don't really do anything of any purpose, you know.
But the purpose is like, you know, horror movie. It's
sure.
To elicit emotion.
It's an aesthetic purpose.
Yeah, but that's certainly a purpose still. That driven by motivations of the audience and the artist. Yeah.
A social purpose. I mean, there's no. It's not just, you know, this ending at the aesthetic. Yeah.
So that might be. It is actually easier to forge relationships, or sometimes easier if there is some kind of outcome, and people look for outcomes. But you have to open up that conversation to say the outcome might be more abstract than you're expecting. I don't know if you found that.
It's true. We applied for grants to do an art installation in the hospital, a previous work of mine, and didn't get results there. But when we said we wanted to do medical research with data at the end of it. It was like, okay, you know, there's more interest in that. So, and that got the ball rolling, and then it's gathered its own momentum, and all the serendipity starts flowing. And,
I had an interesting experience when I first went to Japan to meet my master, because they, I'd made all the arrangements and they were expecting a man and also someone much older. So it was quite interesting because no women study traditional arts and crafts. But it was from all of this private research and work over the years that I got invited to this lab in Zurich. So this was a really unusual kind of situation. Generally it's the opposite way. You're kind of knocking on lots of doors and trying to convince people that you can, make some contribution. But I was invited over for a residency and I ended up staying 3 or 4 years. So it's just really lucky, I guess.
Robin, did you have any thoughts about this? I mean, you've obviously worked with local councils, being the Melbourne Council.
Local councils.
And you have sort of more structures when you move into local government.
Oh, well, it was certainly an interesting paradigm shift for me with the giant theremin. It was the first time I'd ever put anything in a public space, and anything of that scale. Usually I'd flown under the radar with health and safety issues with my laser show at various punk squats around the world, I guess. But it was certainly a different level of bureaucracy. And but I think the commonality I have with the experiences that are being articulated here is with the Bionic Ear Institute, where I did a residency there making music for people with cochlear implants, and that was an art science sort of crossover situation. And that relationship actually came about because I was doing these synesthetic audiovisual shows, and one of the neuroscientists from the Bionics Institute kept turning up, and we just kept talking about the hardware and the way, you know, what he was working on. He was working on a pitch perception project, trying to work out how to make the implant itself better for the reception of music, and we sort of cooked up the idea that maybe we could shift the focus and make music that was addressing the hardware. But certainly, once you have that relationship with a person in an institution like that, then the collaborative process is really quite brilliant. Collaborating with local councils is a little bit different. It's just a little bit more about. I think the funniest situation I had with the giant theremin was that the site chosen for it was right next to a train pass through that was clocking at about 115 decibels, and they still had to bring someone down with the dB meter to make sure my instrument wasn't over 75. And I just, it's sort of situations like that where you're confronted with something that's kind of patently absurd, and you're sort of not allowed to point it out. It's a weird moment.
If we haven't got have we got any more questions?
I think we had one more.
One more? While we're just waiting for that one, I suppose something about new media, which is obviously very prevalent, is this relationship and these collaborations that you all have to form. The technology is obviously moving very quickly, and you can't. I mean, in your work particularly, you know, you've had to actually collaborate to actually create it.
Yeah, I mean, my work was collaborated in a sense with like fabricators. You know, I designed like a prototype and did the aesthetic research as to this thing that I wanted, and it was very much the model of like a filmmaker in a sense. You know, like I had this kind of vision for this thing, lots of sketches, and I knew how I wanted it to behave, this kind of limited movement that was kind of ambiguous. Was it dead? Was it alive? And I just found the right person who was like totally in tune with my kind of vision, which was fantastic. And that's kind of a rarity sometimes, I think, you know. But as a result, we've formed this great relationship, so hopefully I'll do further kind of projects with them. The dilemma with my stuff is that it was quite costly to produce, as is a lot of work, you know, in this new media kind of field. And that's a little bit kind of problematic, you know, so I need to kind of figure out ways of making stuff that's kind of cheaper.
Real people, maybe.
I think it's the wrong industry, isn't it?
Possibly.
sort of given the diversity of where you find your partnerships and your funding, yet you're all obviously artists and creative people, as the National New Media Initiative sort of comes to its final year, what sort of significance and importance do exhibitions and awards such as this play in your ecology of sense of, you know, your practice and that fitting into the cultural paradigm of the 21st century? Anyone?
Discuss.
Great question.
I just got a quick response to that, because I mentioned to some people in Melbourne, you know, this National New Media Award, blah, 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 that's happening in Queensland. It's this big, major kind of thing. Some of them hadn't heard of it, you know, and they were actually more kind of visual artists. And it made me realise there is this kind of division still in Australia between what we call new media art and media art practice and visual artists. And it was really highlighted by that fact, you know, like, this is a massive award. You haven't heard of it? You know, I've heard of your awards. You know? So, yeah.
They were just jealous. They're totally no.
I'd have to agree with that to some extent, because I actually come from a painting, printmaking background, so, you know, it's taken me a long time to actually move into this field, and you know, I was totally ignorant, really, of a lot of the other artists practicing in this area, you know, and what was being produced out there. I was just sort of going alone, you know, and thought I was being completely original there. You always find out you're not, you know. But yeah, I'd sort of agree to that to a certain extent. Yeah.
I think in terms of Libby's question about the balance, I'd say I've only been in a few big kind of shows, like high-profile, big institution group exhibitions of new media art, and they've been really good for showing work. But then a lot of my work is actually more kind of workshop, residency, small spaces, and it's a bit more experimental, and I often like conduct the research in those exhibitions as well. And there's just that mix there. And so I'm actually getting more interested in how I really consolidate that idea about the workshops as part of what you do, the activity, and the workshops as another way that people come to know and understand and engage with the work. So yeah, it's interesting. And this whole kind of living labs thing, like you've got the edge here, and all these different hybrids between different ways that people get into your work and exchange ideas through the work. So yeah, it's really exciting. There's a lot more opportunities coming up. It's not just the big, you know, blockbuster shows, as great as they are.
But at the same time, it would be interesting to bring some of that also into the museums and into the big institutions, perhaps, right? I mean, that's because I would say that this is definitely not only an Australian problem. I know it more in Europe, and there's very few institutions in every major city that would ever, you know, undertake this big risk of bringing, you know, so much people with so many cables and stuff and blinking things into their space, right? And therefore I would actually like to take this opportunity. I think we all feel like that. This is really, it's a pity that it's in its last iteration, and this is a very rare big thing that the GOMA takes there. I mean that.
It's not the end of GOMA's interest in new media, though. I think this is really actually just the start, and I think we'll be looking for really vibrant new ways to bring it into our general programming throughout the whole exhibition program. So I think it's just the beginning.
I think a show like this, though, too, even for the artists, it's I mean, just the very nature of the sort of technologies that we're using, a lot can go wrong. So you're really putting yourself on the line, you know, by doing a show like this where you've got such an investment into it, in it, and. Did you mention that at the beginning of the exhibition? Yes, it's whether it's, you know, all going to be still working at the end, I suppose, you know.
So in and of itself, it is significant, I think, and also in terms of building a community with the audience, there's still a bit. I mean, it's still not, obviously not as established as many other art forms, and And the bringing together also, I love the idea that there's the Prada thing and this new media exhibition, and then the sculpture exhibition, that they all come together in one building. That's really this kind of like crossing of disciplines.
And I think this particular show, in its absence of really traditional new media, or perhaps what might be considered traditional new media screen-based works, is really extraordinary. And I think we all feel that we feel very privileged to be part of that, but also we all independently think that it's a really great show. It's a really interesting snapshot of what's happening in people's practices in 2012, looking at sort of moving forward into technologies of the future and new ways of working and collaborative practices. So yeah, I think it's a really unique show.
Yeah,
and
I think the other thing that really does come out is that whole nature of audience engagement too, and you know, we're all very much driven by a process here, and it's a very important part of our practice, and to be able to not even, you know, more than just engaging the audience, we you know, most of us rely on other people that we collaborate with, so you know, that too has been an essential part of our practice. So you know, it's a lot about that engagement, I think. Yeah.
Well, hopefully, thank you everybody. Hopefully that's whetted your appetite to come back this week and to see the show. I'd like to just quickly mention that we do actually have, as part of the award, a $25,000 scholarship for an emerging Queensland-based artist. I do encourage the younger people in the audience I can see here, and all your emerging artists within 5 years of your practice, to actually apply for the award. It's a simple process. I'll be actually the contact person for these details, so if you'd like to have a chat to me about it further in the foyer after this, I'd be more than happy to talk about it further. I think, Peter,
great. We should mention the catalogue. This will be in the bookshop. I don't think the bookshop will be open on the way out, but it will be there tomorrow. So when you come back in the afternoon, after the winner's been announced, grab one of these. It's really informative. It's a great overview. And it just expands on some of the discussion that's been happening tonight. So I think that's the end of the evening. If you could help me thank the panel, the finalists, for the 2012 National New Media Art Award. We wish you all the best. And to everyone here tonight in the audience, thank you for coming. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.